Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, and today I am joined by Kari Lewis. Kari, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. So, Kari Lewis, a licensed professional counselor. Um, I've done a host of things. I think one of the first jobs after I graduated was I was a counselor with the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. So started there, transitioned to family therapy, which I soon quickly found that was not it for me. Um, and then I think I was there for a year. Then I transitioned to the crisis mobile team with Milwaukee County. And so I would respond to mental health crisis in the community, complete mental health assessments, and kind of determine whether the individual needed to stay in the hospital or are they safe enough to go home with support. And then soon after that, well, not soon after, but transitioned over to Marquette University, started off in the counseling center. And my specific role was the coordinator of Black and African American students. And so I would see all students, but focus a lot of my outreach on that particular population.
Sure.
And then I was there for almost 2 years when I seen a position in athletics and I said, just kind of see if this is something for me. And so I applied, and now I'm the director of student athlete mental health at Marquette University.
Yeah, which is awesome. That's actually how we connected, was just kind of the background in sports performance type things.
Yeah.
I like to kind of, I don't want to say dig in. This is not hard-hitting investigative journalism. But like, did you always know you wanted to work in mental health? Kind of, how'd you like get into it
Yeah.
from the
So
get-go?
I went to the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. Now I'm a first gen student. And so I went there pretty much last minute, like college is, everybody's doing it our senior year. So I guess I'll go too. So
Sure.
landed at UW Platteville, and I remember, so I played basketball in high school. And so when I got to Platteville, the guy who recruited us left, and I thought I was told that I would get a full scholarship, and not really knowing that D3 schools don't necessarily offer that.
Right.
And so I played a little bit, and then I ended my career before the real season started. So I was just doing preseason workouts and all that stuff. And so I was like, yep, I'm going to school for pre-med. This is what I'm here for. And then I quickly realized that Platteville is not a nursing school. Nor is science on my side. I struggle with science, and
Sure.
so I became undecided. And I remember Craig Miller. He was my first psych professor, Psych 101, and he talked about a lot of some of his clients and stories. And one of the things that stood out in Psych 101 was the bystander effect. And I was like, oh my God, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Do you remember KDG? She lived in New York.
Yep.
And she was being murdered, and so many people heard her, but they didn't call 911 because they were like, oh, the next person will call. So I was very intrigued. And so my sophomore year is when I declared my major being psychology.
Sure.
And so I felt confident. I felt like that was me. Of course, I was just kind of like the friend that everybody went to talk to. So I'm like, okay, this is my lane. So
Yeah.
it was then
Sure.
I knew. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a similar story in that I was pre-med undergrad. I was psych and pre-med. I knew I wanted to do something with psychology, but I thought I wanted to be a psychiatrist. And so I was like, we're going to do med school. We're going to do the whole thing. And OChem 2 was like, no, you're not going to do
Not
it.
at all.
So that was kind of my experience. But that's interesting. When I was in the sports performance world, I was at a D3 school, and there's like a weird, I always felt, I would say, unethical at some points recruiting process for people around academic versus athletic scholarships, because I would overhear just the way the offices were. I'd hear other coaches pitching to recruits like, oh, and like, we're going to get you these scholarships. And it sounds like an athletic scholarship, but it's packaged in these different ways. So D3s will offer academic and all these other things to kind of make up for it. But D3 schools are not allowed to offer athletic scholarships.
Oh, and I couldn't found that out.
Yeah, but knowing too from the other side of it that like I have heard from multiple people, and I've experienced myself, that sometimes there are coaches or recruiters who are kind of walking or making that a little bit of a gray area where like it's presented one way and then it kind of, and like you're left with it, right? Now you're a student. Now you're enrolled, you got your classes picked out, and like Wait, what?
Yeah, and he left. The recruiter left. So when we
Yeah.
got there, I was looking for him. They were like, no, he transferred to a different school. And I'm like, well, now I feel stuck.
Yeah,
But
for sure. It sounds like it's good that it worked out for
it
you.
worked out.
But
It worked out.
it is frustrating, and I think like there's this highlight the news headlines that are like Michigan self-imposing, limitations because of Jim Harbaugh's recruiting and stuff. Like you'll hear the D1s that are doing things that are kind of shady around recruiting, and there's millions of dollars on the line.
Mhm.
But like it happens in D2, it happens in D3, like and these 17, 18-year-old kids
Yeah.
who are trying to go to school
Yeah.
are the ones who are having to deal with that.
Yeah, and really being first generation
Hmm.
and not knowing like what's what. And it's not necessarily to blame the recruiter, but it's more for us now knowing the information that we should have asked. Like maybe I should have asked a little bit more questions, or maybe even my mom being a little bit more present in some of those conversations, right?
Sure.
Because I just remember being dropped off by my mom, and then that was it. Like for the longest, she thought I was like a child psych major, and I kept telling her, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
And so with us just kind of not being aware, we just kind of went with the flow.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
it's okay. It worked out.
It did work out.
Yeah.
But and then probably segueing a little bit into current stuff, having that experience helpful when you're working in the college setting now, because you have students who you can relate with, and you can say like, hey,
Yes.
these are the questions you should be asking.
Yes. And so, for the most part, just even with my caseload within athletics, they have been recruited, and I see them after they've started.
Right.
So if some of those questions do come up, of course, we're having a dialogue about that. But for the most part, most recently, actually, a lot of the coaches have been saying, okay, well, let's put Kari on our stop to have students talk with her about maybe her experience, what she does within athletics, and so we can have like honest dialogue there.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I'm getting students before, but man, they're recruiting some heavy hitters
Yeah.
from all different type of sports. So I mean, there are so many schools coming after some of these students,
Right.
and Marquette is in the running, and
Yeah.
of course they're going to bring out the bells and whistles, right?
Sure.
So
And the D1 recruiting scene is significantly different than the D3.
different, so different, right?
Yes, we're talking about very different things. We'll
Yeah.
get into that a little bit too. But so working in community mental health for a while,
Yeah.
I kind of chuckled when you said family therapy wasn't your thing, because
Yeah.
I'm a licensed. My initial was marriage family therapy, so that's what my licensure is. Because I love couples, and so like I enjoy
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But yes, it's one of those things where like you either kind of love it or you hate it, and
Yeah.
there's not a lot of in between.
So I did this for a year.
Mhm.
And I'll keep them nameless. And the specific therapy technique that we were using. So essentially what I would do is I would get a referral from whether it's MPD, whether it's MPS for an identified student who was struggling.
Mhm.
And so I'd meet with the family, and we had this specific model that we had to follow, and it was by the T,
Sure.
right? And I started to notice that this didn't work well for a lot of my families that I was seeing. And a lot of them were Black or brown students, poverty, and it just didn't feel right after a while, because I would have to go in and rapidly start treatment,
Yeah.
rapidly engage, and sometimes they weren't there. Sometimes I've walked in homes where they knew we had family therapy, and then you got uncle or aunt over here drinking and smoking, and we're still trying to have this therapy. And so I took a step back and went to the original study, like, this come about? And the population was white, male, suburban
Sure.
kids. And I'm like, that's not what I'm seeing at all.
Yeah.
And so I made a decision to leave, just because it just didn't feel good for me. I feel like I wasn't going into the homes and doing what I thought the family needed. I was just doing what the study or this specific therapy had asked me to do.
Right.
And so then I transitioned over to the crisis mobile team, which was fun. I will say that that has to be my most favorite job
Sure.
thus far.
Yeah.
Although it sounds scary. But we would respond to crisis all day, every day.
Mhm.
And that part of the community I enjoyed, because a lot of them looked like me.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them came from backgrounds that I am familiar with. And so if there was an individual who was having a crisis, right? And they were black or brown, and I would come in, you can almost see like a sigh of relief.
Sure.
Like somebody who looks like me who may be able to get me versus an NPD officer, right, in full uniform.
Right.
And so we were able to talk to them differently than the police officers were. So I really enjoyed that piece.
Yeah.
Now we talk about self-care during that time. Well, that's a whole different conversation.
Sure. Well, and I think enjoying that work and feeling like you're making a difference is great. Like there's so much research that says having somebody who has a gun show up to a crisis makes it worse. But also then resources in Milwaukee. Like I've lived here my whole life. I've done mental health for almost 15 years now. Like a mobile response team is great. But if there aren't resources on the back end, if we don't have social workers and we don't have people who we can connect to, then probably you're just responding to a crisis again in another year or 6 months or whatever, because there's limited access to psychiatry in the in the county for sure. I would say in the city as a whole, like suburbs included, and like child therapists, like I have therapists on this podcast all the time who are local and we're like, hey, do you have any good psychiatrists? Hey, do you have any? Because like there are limited resources. And so responding to crisis out of uniform with a social worker, somebody who has a psychology background is great. But then it can be really frustrating too to be on the back end of like, right, these people aren't actually getting the help they need because the resources in the city are so limited.
Yeah. And that part I do appreciate about the crisis mobile team because we started to follow up, right? So if we seen an individual who had an initial crisis, we would get them connected somehow, some way with an appointment. And that took time, right? So you would have to complete the mental health assessment and then sit there and call offices to ensure that they are connected.
Yeah.
And if they are connected, then we follow up within a week or even longer than that to say, okay, did you attend the appointment? Do you need a ride? Sometimes we did have some barriers, right, with insurances, but with us being an Access Clinic or Access Point within Milwaukee, we were able to get them connected with insurance.
Right.
And so there was a lot of behind the scenes work that I feel like many people may not know we did.
Yeah.
And it was time consuming, so time consuming, but it was nice to see that full circle.
Yeah.
There were times where we weren't able to get people connected because of maybe they had little to no motivation to even follow up. They didn't want to ride from us. They didn't want us to continue to talk to them. So that part was frustrating, but for the most part, we tried our best to get them connected.
Yeah. And I think it's that model of like comprehensive care where you have somebody who can do the connection, who can do the follow-up. And then what you hinted at a little bit of like having to do your own self-care and take care of yourself, because not only do you having probably like secondary trauma from showing up to deal with crises, but also all the paperwork and stuff like that's time consuming. And then all of a sudden you're putting in more time, you're staying late, like you just want to finish a little bit more, or you're going to make a couple more phone calls, and then like that's a recipe for burnout.
So during that time of me working with a crisis mobile team, my husband was a police officer.
Okay.
So we were crisis workers, what we felt like all the time. In addition to that, we had 2 little ones.
Sure.
And so really trying to find that balance of doing some of the great work that we do, being great husband and wife, being great parents. That was always a struggle. And so I'll never forget there. I don't remember exactly what happened at work, but I was pissed. And I remember coming home and being very irritable with my kiddos. And that is not who I am. If you know me and with my kids, that is not how I communicate, respond. And I caught myself and I said, from this day forward, I will give 100% to my kids and I'll try to give 100% at work, but I can't slack on my kids ever. And they were so little and impressionable. And, you know, kiddos that age, they were, I think 1 and 3 or maybe 1 and 3. They love on us and they want to be around us. And how dare I, right, deprive them for that? So that was the day I had to kind of wake up and really start to focus on self-care. And then even with my husband being a police officer in a predominantly white department, I had to continue to check in on him because that was challenging. And I'm like, do you need a bath when you get home? Like, what do you like? What was it that we both needed at that time? And we had to find it. And sometimes we continue to this day to find it. He's not a police officer anymore.
Yeah.
But that was a real tough transition within our lives.
Sure. Yeah, and it's one of those things. I mean, it's for me, it's part of the reason why I do the podcast. But like our lives as providers are also going on. Like as much as people need help, and like I'm a relationship therapist, so like people in their relationships come and see me. Like I have a relationship too. Like,
Yeah.
So it's being able to kind of have those boundaries, but also reevaluate, because sometimes you have a really heavy case, or if you're working in crisis management, all your cases are heavy.
Yeah.
And like that takes a toll. Like our brains and our bodies as providers aren't wired any differently than anyone else's.
Exactly.
And so it's making sure and evaluating. Like, and I think it's great, like, to catch that. I have a lot of these conversations with providers, but like, right, like there's that potential to miss that stuff, or to not realize that you're doing it, and like it can go on for a while. So being able to catch it and have some grace for yourself and say, hey, I'm doing too much.
Yes.
Or like, hey, I need to kind of reprioritize things, I think is really like, that's the key.
Yeah. And then also just being okay with acknowledging that, because there is a lot of pressure on providers to have their shit together.
Yes.
And I am the first one to say, nope, sometimes I struggle. Some days are better than others, and it's okay to say that, but sometimes I have my highs and lows, and it's okay to check in.
Right.
There was a particular client when I was working for the crisis mobile team. I was telling her great advice, at least what I thought was great advice. And it's almost like I was looking in the mirror at myself. And I said, how dare I share all these gems with her, and I go home and do the complete opposite. And that was another moment in my career when I'm like, you know what? You have to be real and you have to be authentic, because people are coming to you and they're trusting you.
Yeah.
And so you have to make those same movements, right? Because there's some moments just kind of like in my life where I'm like, okay, I'm doing well, but then I feel stuck. And what do I do to get out of this stuckness? And whatever she said in that session, it was kind of like a punch in the gut, because I'm like, you know what? You got to do the work too.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I've been trying since.
And for me, early in my career, I was, I don't know, hung up on like having good results. So like a lot of my mental health was tied to, was I helping my clients? And like, not like I was trying to fix everything, but like if a case was spinning wheels, or like it just didn't seem like it was clicking, like I was so early in my career, I had such a high standard that I was like, I can help everybody. I can do all of this. I'm gonna like, and like I had to learn, be like, you gotta let that go. Like that cannot be how you define success in your career.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I struggled with, and the people who are listening need to know that I look really, really young. But that was a struggle, right? I remember one of my first jobs as a vocational counselor. I looked like a teenager, and I was 25. I was, doing well at what I was doing, but a lot of people question my ability. They question whether or not I can handle some of those things that they would come into my office with. And I'm like, well, I have the background, allow me to do my job. And so I think with that too, I've always had to prove myself, and just kind of piggybacking off of what you said, that need to fix something, to say, see, I did it.
Yeah.
That can be very exhausting.
Sure.
Yeah. And to this day, some of the students on campus will think I'm a student. And I'm like, married with 2 kids, and so
you do look relatively young. Well, and I can relate. I was young. I started doing therapy when I was 21. And so I graduated early and whatever. But it was one of those things where like, even getting married, like once I had a wedding ring on my finger, like the way people listened to me it's instead different. Of like when I got married at 24, I think. My wife would be mad at me for not knowing 24. But it's one of those things where it's like, right, I had all this schooling, I had all the knowledge, but like I was young, and I look back sometimes like, right, why were people listening to me? I was 21 years old. I didn't know what I was talking about. But it's one of those things where like, right, there are all these different factors, and like I'm white and male, so like people were not challenging me probably the same way they were challenging you. And so it was one of those things where it's like, even just all those factors combine into like, in your own head as a provider, like, am I doing good work? Right. And then like almost to try and go above and beyond. Right.
And I think it definitely, for me, like just over just my career, it felt like it was easier once I got to Marquette. Although students still thought I was a student, but they know what they want.
Yeah.
I love that about this generation. They can tell you, nope, this isn't working, and maybe we should try this. And so being able to receive feedback from students, I think that has helped me in my career because I've been the know it all person in the county as a family therapist, as a vocational rehab counselor. And so now I can sit back and just listen.
Yeah.
I can go to some of these student meetings on campus, whether it's student senate, whether it's like organizations, and actually hear what they want and what they need. And I can take that back into my practice and start to implement things that way. So I appreciate it so much.
For sure. I think that these younger generations know just a ton more about mental health.
Yeah.
Like by the time they show up on campus, I think
Yeah.
mental health has become less stigmatized in that generation, Gen Z for sure. I would say millennials to some degree, but it's definitely better than 15 years ago when I started. There was still so much more stigma around mental health, especially in the Midwest. Like the coasts, everybody's got a therapist, but in the Midwest is still kind of like you deal with your own stuff and you don't bother other people. And I think this younger generation is just aware, like mental health, you can't do that.
Yeah. And so even some of the challenges that I see now just within sports is that traditional tough it out, you got it, you're okay. And so although our students are being very vocal about it, and I spoke about this last week doing a big East interview, but they're often met with resistance. Because traditionally, once again, you have that tough it out mentality, but some coaches are still, they're coming along. And I appreciate working alongside coaches that are willing to listen, but naturally, right, you just kind of go back to what you know.
Yeah.
And so being able to talk to coaches one-on-one to say, hey, what's your idea about mental health? What do you feel like you need as a coach? And what do you typically hear? What are some of the themes that are coming from your students? And so we have those dialogues, and I try to make it where the coaching staff feels so comfortable with me, where if anything happens or they feel like they have a silly question, they can just text me, they can call me, say, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
And I love that piece because the more we can work together, the more I can help you, you can help me, we can help the students.
Right.
So, yep, they are vocal, but it's still like that traditional sports mentality.
Yeah. I experienced that too. I D3, so different, but I think it was one of those things where like for frame of reference, the Ohio State has around 800 student athletes.
Okay. Wow.
And I'm at this D3 school that also had 800 student athletes, largest D3 sports program in the nation. And I was the only person doing mental health with them, which is a terrible setup. Like that's awful. And so but I did initially in building kind of the program and the way that I was doing things was so much more rapport building with the coaches than with the students.
Absolutely.
Because figuring out like some of this is systemic, some of it is coming from the coach down, some of it is the culture of the program of, hey, like, oh, this is tradition. I'm like, no, that's hazing. Like that, you can't do that anymore. This isn't a tradition. This is a problem. But if you don't have buy-in from the coach, then like you're not going to get buy-in from the student athletes because they're going to be worried about playing time, or they're going to be worried about being labeled a problem or whatever. So it really is building with coaches who, for the most part, are a little bit older and might have some of those older mentalities around mental health.
Yeah. And I think the NCAA is doing such a good job at kind of talking about these best practices.
Yes.
And so now administrators, they're listening, and not to say that they weren't listening before, but they're like, okay, now we really have a push. And so when I first got there to the athletic department, there was a coach that was, that was somewhat challenging. And at first I was like, oh, like how dare they? And I'm here for a reason. And I had to kind of take a step back and say, well, what is it, Kari? Why are you feeling the way that you're feeling? But it was like that challenging piece, right? Being a young Black woman director. And I'm like, nope, I gotta walk in with my chest out. But really, it was kind of like that lack of information, the lack of relationship that I have with this individual. And I'm like, what do I need to do as a provider?
Yeah.
Right. And some people are like, oh, whatever, I'm not changing anything that I do. They need to meet me where I am. But I know that's not going to work.
Yeah.
And so my approach was completely different. And we started to kind of have these conversations, and we're like, we are just alike in some ways.
Yeah.
And so we were able to see those similarities. And I think that kind of opened the door for us to have those conversations. So
Yeah.
yeah.
But it's weird, and I think I have ADHD, so this is gonna be like I did all this stuff in such a short amount of time, but not in a healthy way, just in an ADHD sort of way. Like I was coaching, so I coached women's volleyball. I was an adjunct instructor in the psychology department, and I'm doing mental health. So it was like,
Wow.
which is what happens in D3, which is why people burn out. But it's also one of those things where it's like, um, being able to say like, hey, this is like my experience as a student athlete because I played volleyball.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like my experience as a coach. It
Mm-hmm.
helps that as a coach, like my team was really good. Like we won
Mm-hmm.
conference 4 out of 5 years while I was there.
Nice.
And so being able to present like, hey, you can have a championship culture that is also supportive
Yeah.
of mental health. Because I think sometimes people think of like Bill Belichick and like that kind of like old school mentality, like no one complains and we have a strict curfew and blah
Yeah.
blah blah. And like I remember sitting in a department meeting where people were like, well, if we can't make our kids run till they puke, how do we punish them? And I was just like, gang, we shouldn't be punishing anyone anymore. Like that's not how we do things. And they're like, well, how do you like reprimand your players? Like, don't let them play. Playing time. And they're like, well, that's our best player. It's like, okay, like no, we gotta reevaluate. But being able to say like, hey, this is like the championship culture where like you
Yeah.
can have fun
Yeah.
and still prioritize winning. Like it's
Yeah.
not an either or. It's not like everybody has to be like hating their lives and coming to 5:30 workouts and like
Yeah.
being miserable. Like
Yeah.
there's a way to build a culture
Yes.
that wins
Yeah.
and has fun.
And I think it's so new that um maybe coaches aren't aware of how to approach that piece. And so what was it? Earlier this year I went to a conference. It's the Big Sky conference. And this was my first conference that I've attended with all mental health professionals embedded in athletics or working with athletics, I should say. So, so many different colleges, professional sports, and we were in the room and I kind of looked around like we are talking about the same thing. We are talking about how mental health is over here and athletics is over here. How do we then merge these two? And I started with little to no guidance. No, little guidance. I will say that little guidance. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I come in as a superwoman like I always do at my other jobs? How do I make this work?
Yeah.
So I started back in August of last year. The conference was in February, and it also gave me like some relief because I'm like, oh, it's just me, right? I'm not the only one trying to break down these barriers, and so that gave an opportunity for me to connect with so many different professionals at different institutions outside of the Big East to say, what are you doing? How did this work? What challenges are you having? And so that has provided me some comfort. In addition, I work for a great department. I will say that. I'm going to toot Marquette's horn. So I have a lot of autonomy to kind of figure a lot of things out. What's working for this? What's not working? Any new initiative I want to bring in, they're like, go for it, Kari. What do you need, as support? And so I love that piece. But because I've worked in different organizations that have the structure, because I don't have that structure, I'm always thinking like, oh, am I missing something? Like, what am I doing? And then that kind of sends me down anxiety attack, right? Because I'm like, I just want to make this work. So shout out to Marquette, first of all.
Which is awesome. And I did I interviewed for a position at UConn back in the day, which I was very excited about, and didn't get, so I private practice. But like, it's one of those things where it's like, it is, mental health has permeated, I think, like the social norms. Like people know it's a thing, but it is taking a long time to get into athletics. Like most professional sports teams, but not all, have a sports psychologist on staff.
Yeah.
And so like, even I think that the fact that not all of them have that is crazy. And like it filters to D1 first, and then to D2, and then to D3 as far as college athletics, and then like anything down towards youth sports is great. But like it's definitely one of those things as a youth sports coach way back in the day. I remember standing up. I coached women's volleyball, girls volleyball at the time, and I stood up at like a conference wide like Badger Sports was like the state of Wisconsin volleyball.
Yeah.
And like was like, yo, if like we have somebody who's suicidal, we need to like say something about that. And like the presenters' faces went white and like everybody's like shoulders like just panic in the room. And I was like, oh, sorry, like I'm a mental health provider. Like I can talk about this, so that like everyone's on the same page about this. But like just that lack of awareness. And even when I was in athletics, like the athletic trainers know about mental health, they know how to
Mhm.
spot it. But like when you
Mhm.
have a kid who's on the bus for travel and they're having a panic attack, like
What do we do?
athletic trainers are like, well, I'm monitoring their heart rate. I'm like, stop doing that. You're
Yeah.
making like you're stressing them out.
A little bit.
So
Yeah.
it's I think it's great, but it's also
Mhm.
like, yes, slow and being
Yeah.
able, if you're the only person in the department or you have a small department, like
Yeah.
trying to normalize this
Yeah.
stuff, not just for coaches and players, but
Right.
yourself as a professional.
Yeah.
Because for a lot of times, like, right, I'll go back to Ohio State because it's whatever, they have a lot of money. But they had 4 or 5 sports psychologists just for their football program, but then one for the rest of the department. And it's like,
Mhm.
right.
Mhm.
So, for a lot of sports or athletics, like they have that one sport that's making money,
Yeah.
and then everybody else is kind of having to work around that. So
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where like it will continue to grow and get better, but it is still, I think, behind what maybe the average person expects. You think
Yeah.
sports program, they've got all the resources in the world, and like that's not always how it looks.
No, it's not. And as of now, well, I won't say as of now. Last year, there were about 350 student athletes, and prior to me coming on, I knew that, and I
Mhm.
knew the person who worked there before
Yeah.
because we consulted because I was in the counseling
So
center,
we're at the
right?
counseling
And
center.
so one of the first things I did is I took maybe 2 weeks to reach out to community providers, you being one,
Yeah.
because I knew that I could not do it all.
Right.
Thank God all 350 didn't reach out, but if they had, at least I have a list of resources that I can say, oh, go talk to this person, or
Yeah.
how about we do this? And so luckily I wasn't able to, or I didn't have a waiting list.
Mhm.
I seen 16% of the students, which I felt like that was manageable. The parts that gets a little bit challenging is the administrative work
Right.
and the phone calls, and
Yes.
you're still programming, and there's a
Right.
lot to our roles that a lot of people may not know.
Yeah. Well, and you're programming often creating the program because it's not like there's like the NCAA does. I will say I agree. Like the NCAA has a very like they've got
Yeah.
PDFs, they've got things, they got their best practices is well researched and it's
Yeah.
backed up. So
Yeah.
like that's easy. But then like how to implement any of that or what to
Yeah.
do, and like right, you can find some other stuff out there. Like I remember talking to people at like Northwestern and like, but it's figuring out like how do you have time to meet with these people?
Yeah.
Like you're doing these things, you want to meet with students one on one, you want to maybe present, and like I
Yeah.
loved presenting to entire teams. Like that's really what I like to do. I like the one on one stuff too, but um and you have all these good ideas and
Yeah.
then you're having to go to department meetings or you're having to like do budget stuff because you need more money, and like
Yeah.
a lot of that stuff takes up time. So it's
It
not just how
does.
many student athletes can you see in a week,
Yeah.
it's how many student athletes can you see and do all this other stuff.
Yeah. So yesterday, it's funny. I just met with the director of the counseling center. So she
Mhm.
was my old supervisor, and every now and then we kind of check in because she knows I'm the only one.
Yep.
And so, and let me just say this: I'm the only mental health provider there.
Mhm.
I think I have a great sports medicine team. Like my director is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
The trainers are great.
Yeah.
But in terms of doing that individual work, sometimes it can get a lot. And I'm like, oh, who do I talk to? There's no clinicians here. So let me go to the counseling center.
Yeah.
So we kind of connect to see like what are some of the things that you're doing well, and what are ways that we can help with. And
Mhm.
so I appreciate that piece. And there, prior to me coming to athletics, there are a lot of presentations that I already had, right, from the counseling center,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
I can just kind of carry over. But how do I cater this now to student athletes?
Mhm.
So I don't know how many student athletes we have this semester. I'm sure the number, it's probably already out there. We kind of kick off this week. Actually, now that I
Yeah.
think about it, looking at my calendar, we have the first year orientation and their parents and things like that this Thursday and Friday. And this is going to be so interesting because now you have students coming and with their parents, and so the parents want to know everything, and
Yeah.
you have to be the one that stands up in front of them,
Mhm.
and they may be shipping their kid off to a new state without them.
Yeah.
Well, I want to know about their mental health. Well, let me tell you about HIPAA.
Yeah.
And when they turn 18, let me tell you about how that works. And so that part is challenging because
Yeah.
they want to know like how well their students are doing.
Sure.
Um,
But it's that's a huge recruiting tool, and to any athletics department
yeah.
that is not advertising mental health or doesn't have mental health, like you're behind the curve because parents especially care about what the mental health services look like on
Oh,
campus.
absolutely.
I remember like when we would have student or campus visit days, like I'd have a table all to myself about mental health setup because like it was such a big selling point,
Yeah.
especially when I was at D3, like nobody else had it. So like
Yeah.
if you're choosing
Yeah.
between one or two schools, like, hey, this one's got mental health services.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they didn't keep mental health services, but it's one of those things where like that definitely matters. I want to segue a little bit about like counseling centers on college campuses are another area where it's like, man, talk about an underserved population. I think because my experience being a director and sitting in high level meetings was like nobody knows, like they're thinking about capitalism around mental health. Like, how do we make money off of this? And it's like, that can't, like, we're investing that money back into our students. It's not a money making endeavor. It's about like, hey, our students aren't dropping out. Hey, our students aren't like in crisis. Hey, our students are graduating and they're staying on camp. Like it's about like bettering the students, not necessarily about making money, because that was always the pushback that I got again at a D3, so limited resources, but like it was.
But then nobody's questioning tutoring services,
right?
The way that they, question mental health services. And you're right, like it's not no one's making money, but we also want to see our students thrive from the time they get on campus to the time they graduate.
And so I think I know because we worked with JED, which is an organization that comes to different college campuses and does mental health work and kind of reviews how's your mental health program set up. But like, so many college campuses across the nation do not have enough counselors on campus.
No.
And the ratio, even that's acceptable, and I'm putting that in quotes, this is a podcast, you can't see it, but like the ratio is like one counselor per 1,000 students. And like I will say as a therapist, like that's an awful ratio to think is okay.
I know when I was hired at the counseling center, it was at the kind of top of COVID 2020. So there were a lot of protests at Marquette because the students of color, particularly Black students, didn't agree with how the university responded to the killing of George Floyd. There were a lot of things happening in the city of Milwaukee, and being a student of color, and I can speak for this, right? Because I attended a predominantly white institution, you want to feel safe. You want to feel like you matter and the administration takes you seriously, right? And so one of the initiatives from the Black students were, we need a Black clinician on campus. And so this is kind of part of how my job was created, although the counseling center had already been looking for a position like that too, but I think it just kind of blossomed from that. So when I started, you can probably imagine that I was the most requested counselor.
Sure.
And that part, cultural taxation, like you are you're the go-to person for a lot of things. And I remember having conversations with my colleagues because some of the student organizations like the Black Student Council, the Black Student Union, some of our Black Greek sororities and fraternities, they would meet after hours. Now our hours ended at 4:30. I knew that maybe they couldn't make it, or they couldn't have a meeting between 8 and 4:30. So it was part of my duty, at least I felt, to meet them where they were. So that's me staying after at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. And sometimes, right, I enjoyed it, but sometimes I'm like, oh, I got to get home to my kiddos. But I knew we needed to meet them somewhere, right? And I remember the front desk staff at the time, she was like, yeah, everybody is calling for you. And I'm like, I'm grateful. That means I'm doing great work, but break. You know what I mean? And that was tough because you don't want to say that because, students need help. But that was a moment where I had to do some checking in and say, well, how can I lessen my load? A lot of that lessening was, I'm not going to these diversity committee meetings. I don't want to go.
Right.
No, thank you.
Well, and it's so hard to balance that because when you're one of the few people on campus and like I was working in that role through COVID. So like all these student athletes who have limited coping skills other than athletics suddenly don't have their sport and can't work out and do all the things that they do to stay sane. So that was tough. But then, yes, like culturally with George Floyd, we had the shooting down in the Waukesha area around the same time, shortly after. So like as a therapist, I'm trying to work with like the psych department. We're putting on this event. We have to have it outside of the football field because we can't gather, but we're trying to give students who want to have a voice. And so it's like all these things and like, right, you're doing all this stuff,
Yeah.
trying to meet with
Yeah.
athletes, trying to like connect
Yeah.
with people, and it's important work, and yet like you're limited on these are the hours, or this is your salary, or like this is what you're only getting paid for, and right, then your private life too.
Yeah. Tell you this, during COVID, it was tough, of course, for everyone, but I think for mental health professionals, the world was changing. There was so much uncertainty, right? Everybody's running to see a therapist.
Mhm.
The therapists were at home trying to figure out how the hell to make this work.
Yes.
Right? We don't know what's going on. So
Yeah.
at the time, I was a crisis counselor and we were working from home. My kiddo, he was in K5, trying to figure out schooling for him. My
Yeah.
daughter was 2. She was just everywhere at that time. And there's times where I put her in my son's virtual class. She got kicked out because she was being a 2-year-old. But there was so much uncertainty, so much worry, so much stress for us. Like, how do we make this work?
Yeah.
I remember saying, I'm waking up having so much anxiety about logging in from home. And I remember looking at my kiddo. He was peeking around the corner into my room because that's where I have all of my meetings. And he said, it was 7 o'clock at night. And I'm just kind of like on the computer looking at Amazon stuff.
Yeah.
And he's whispering, he's like, are you on the phone? And I felt so bad because he could not be who he was in his own house. And I was like, yep, another reason for me to kind of like check out.
Yeah.
So I started to say, when was I the happiest in my entire life? Because I want to go back there.
Mm-hmm.
The happiest I felt like I was is when I was pregnant and in labor. And I was like, I'm not having another kid. So what more can I do? So I took additional training to become a doula.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm now a postpartum doula, birth doula,
Yeah.
and recently taken the training to become certified in perinatal mood disorders.
Sure.
Right, to kind of focus on birthing parents after babies here. And so I took control of that because I wanted to continue to do my job in therapy, but also find that hobby like good.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, watching a baby born, I would encourage anybody to do that.
Sure.
Right. And just trying to find ways to fill my cup. And people say, are you crazy? Like, what don't you do? But this is really part of that self-care.
Yeah.
That I want to continue to have because sometimes our days can get long and tired.
Yes.
Right?
Well, and I've talked about this with clients for years, but I've really started pushing it with therapists too. Like, stress management is important, but like that's such a scarcity mindset around like, oh, you're always going to be stressed and like on the edge of burnout. I like that doesn't need to be like we need things that give us joy. We need things like you said that fill our cup. And so like being able to find those things, even if it's something that other people might feel is stressful, like we're kind of weird as therapists where like I tell people like I'm an introvert, so like I'd rather do a suicide assessment than do small talk. And like so it might sound stressful to other people or being around birth or whatever, but like if that's what like you respond well to that and you're used to the crisis stuff, so under pressure, like there's that aspect of like, right, this is what makes me feel like good, this is what fills me up. And seeing my kids see me happy and seeing my husband see me happy, I think that's really, really important. Like when my husband's like, oh, okay, you're doing it today. And like those type of things make me feel good because he's seen me in the moments where I'm just like, I don't know how many more clients I can see today. Yeah. Versus like, you know what, Kari, I'm happy that you're taking control of everything. I think you're doing good. You're positive. You're this. Like, I love those compliments from my family. Yeah, for sure. And like, that was similar. I was doing way too much in a D3 setting through COVID. My wife's a teacher. She's an early childhood teacher. Okay. So I'm like doing hybrid counseling and teaching and trying to coach when sports are shut down, like waking up early to take COVID tests and stuff so we can travel. And then my wife's like, she was pregnant during COVID, so we had a newborn, and then she's trying to teach, and like it's all this stuff. So like, right, just a total revamp of like, I own my own practice now, which lets me have a day off every week, which is nice. Yes. Which is what I'm recording on my day off. But like, it's nice to not have to cram that in between sessions or things like that. And then she's home with our little guy while the other guy's in kindergarten. And like, it makes such a big difference just to be able to be like, stuff at home's okay. Yeah. Like, we're not rushing around. There's no correcting papers. There's no like extracurriculars after like being on a crisis call. Or I would get calls from coaches who are traveling and like this student's having a freak out on the road. What do we do? And like just being able to say like, hey, here's what I feel responsible for responding to. Like, here's when I can be around my
Yeah.
kids. Here's when I'm home and
Yeah.
home. And like, that makes such a huge difference for your mental
Yeah.
health.
Yeah. And I talk a lot about self-care. And when I talk about self-care to my students, I'm like, I know it's cliche, right? Coming from a therapist, but like, let's really get into it. Sometimes we think that self-care looks like going for a massage or going to get your nails done, and maybe it does. But self-care, I can say for me, taking a moment alone in a
Hmm.
house with two kiddos who are Gemini. I don't know how many people out there are, but who require a lot from me, and trying to be the best wife that I can be. We have this implementation in our home that, like, if you need a break, it's okay to say that you need a break, and my
Hmm.
kiddos do a really great job at that. They have no problem going to their room and say, they literally say, I need to take a time out,
Yeah.
because they know that maybe, like, because they're brother and sister and they argue like cats and dogs, sometimes that gets overwhelming, so let me take a break to myself.
Yeah.
And so when I take a break, it's not like, well, where's mama going, what's going on? They know that, okay, things kind of got up there and I need a little bit of time before I come back down,
Yeah.
because I want to be able to give my all.
Yeah.
So normalizing that, for self-care with student athletes, it's always challenging because they have 1,000 things on their plate.
Yes.
And so some of the things that I've prescribed is like, hey, when you're traveling, can you get some noise canceling headphones
Mm.
when you're on the bus? It's okay to kind of like disconnect. Sometimes they're like, but we have to do all these group work activities and this and that. You have to find that moment where it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes to kind of take that time for yourself.
Right.
Because if you're constantly going, we know what happens,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and
So,
a lot of athletes started growing up. They were three-sport athletes. They were in
mhm,
club. They were in high school
mhm.
sports and club sports. And so like they're wired for like this go, go, go all the time, all the time, all the time, not realizing like so much of that when you're young, your body can compensate.
Yeah.
But as you are done growing and you like
Absolutely.
are through some of that, like it starts to take a toll. And
Yeah.
as a coach, we would laugh about like we call our seniors our old ladies in our program because like uh, ice bags everywhere. They're spending so much more time with the trainer.
Yeah.
But like they had a better balance of like, right, we need an hour on the bus to do homework. So like quiet time on the bus
Yeah.
or like whatever it is. And as a coach, like I was always recommending and as a therapist recommending to athletes, like sometimes you just need to like go see a tutor instead of going to practice. And that doesn't sound
Yeah.
like self-care, like that doesn't sound stress relieving, but like being able to like take a moment to not be worried about this
Mhm.
paper or not be worried about a test and
Mhm.
like one practice isn't going to make or break your season.
Yeah.
So like
Yeah.
sometimes taking that time to realize like, okay, I'm doing too much stuff. Like I can't keep
Yeah.
staying up late and sacrificing my sleep, which is
Yeah.
what way too many students do.
Yep.
And so like, right, sometimes it's I'm gonna go to counsel or I'm gonna go to tutoring services
Yeah.
or I'm gonna go to study hall instead of
Yeah.
practice. And like one day can make a huge difference for that mental
Absolutely.
health and just be like, okay, like I'm not a crazy person. I'm on top of things. It's
Yeah.
okay.
I wonder, is it great to have a coach who's an introvert? Because they get it. They get it,
Sure.
right?
I was a terrible student though. I mean, I got good grades, but I have ADHD, so like I never studied or did anything. That's why I
Oh,
rolled in and did stuff. So I had a hard time with that.
yeah.
But two, yeah, like having a coach who has a mental health background is awesome. I think we would end practice
Super.
early and do yoga. Like we were
Love it.
Phil Jackson, who coached the Bulls in the
Mhm.
'90s, was like the Zen master, and he would do all that stuff. So
Yeah.
I was like, yeah,
Yeah.
I get that. We're gonna do a lot of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's tough for student athletes because they're so wired for go, go, go. Every
Yeah.
professor they have thinks that class is the most important class in their
Yeah.
life. Coaches think that the sport is the most important thing in their life.
Yes.
So like there's so many people just acting like learning how to for student athletes to learn how to prioritize themselves is super helpful because everybody in their life
Yeah.
acts like their thing is the most important thing.
Yeah, and I want our students to know that you are the most important thing.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, like you just mentioned, like how do you prioritize yourself? They're like, oh, well, I don't know. Well, no, let's talk about it and just kind of be realistic about it.
Right.
We're in my office. You can talk about whatever. If that means that you need, I don't know, 2 hours of silence because that works for you, it's okay to say that. And,
Right.
we'll try to figure out goals and ways that we can reach that. If it's not 2 hours, how can we lessen the time? Whatever the case is. But being honest about what you need. I
Mhm.
think a lot of students, no, I think a lot of people are not honest about what they need
Yes.
because we're so connected in a way and we want to make sure everybody else is okay. Meanwhile, we are drowning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, no. And so even just like being a mom, I'm like, no, I'm most important right now. Like, I love my kiddos, but I cannot be
Yeah.
the best person to them if I'm not the best person for me. So
Yeah.
anytime that I'm able to kind of take a break in whatever capacity, I'm going to do that. And I have my husband and my kiddos that gets it. Do I have family members that get it? Absolutely not. But it's
Right.
not for them to get,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, helping them to find who they are, find their identity. I think that will always be ongoing,
Mm.
especially when you have so many people pulling at you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said something earlier that I want to circle back just to shout out all the athletic trainers out there because I know in my program that was huge that I had a really good relationship with the athletic trainers and the
Yeah.
athletic trainers were on board for like, yep, tell us more about mental health. How do we help? Like
Yeah.
that makes because those are the people who see student athletes pretty much every single day
Yes.
in addition to coaches. And sometimes trainers spend more time with athletes than coaches do.
Absolutely. And I love that I have a great relationship with the athletic trainers. And it's authentic. It's not specifically work related. So I love going to the trainer's room because when I'm not busy, I like to kind of walk around and just kind of be visible.
Yeah.
So I'm just in there and they're like, how are the kids? And I'm glad that you asked. Or how was your trip? We recently went to Turks and Caicos and they're so interested to know a little bit more about me as an individual
Sure.
versus right
Yeah.
the practitioner. So building those relationships and seeing what they do, Lord have mercy. They do a lot. And I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But
Well,
shout
there's
out to them.
ton of overlap. I got a lot of referrals from athletic trainers because when you're a
Yes.
student athlete who's injured, that takes it's so many student athletes rely on their sport for stress relief. And when you
Mm-hmm.
can't practice or you can't play,
Oh my
a lot of their
gosh.
mental health deteriorates almost instantly. So that
Absolutely.
was a big thing of being aware of like who was injured and like there's the difference between not being able to play because you can't clear concussion protocol versus like being in a walking boot. Like at least everybody can see you're injured, but if you got a concussion, it's like why aren't I playing?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of things around sports performance and mental health that like even some of the science on concussions, like that's new and ongoing. Like we
Yeah.
know it's a thing. We don't
Yeah.
always know how to treat it or how
Yeah.
to like address it right away. So it's a fascinating subject in general, I
It
think.
is. It is. And how to even assess it. I remember my first concussion assessment. I was like, what is happening?
Hmm.
Right. And so, completed the assessment with the kiddo. And then I went back to look at the research and I'm like, holy crap. Like there's so much to even just having a concussion. So soccer, I was talking to one of the soccer coaches because my son plays soccer.
Yeah.
He was like, yep, this is the most intense sport. A lot of people think it's football. I'm like, really? So I talked to my husband, like, maybe we should just kind of like switch sports because it can change a lot of your behaviors. And that
Yes.
scares me. So,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot more training. I'm excited to even get into. This is my first year within athletics. And when I went to the Big Sky Conference, it was like I was sitting back and absorbing all of the information I felt like I should have known, but I didn't. But like, how can I get better at this? How can I get better at this? How
Yep.
can I be an expert at that? Which can be a little crazy with me saying that, but there's so much to just being a student
Yeah.
athlete.
Well, and I think as a profession, it's growing. I think
Mhm.
students will now start like there are now programs for sports
Mhm.
performance. There are now like you
Mhm.
can go get your undergrad in it. You can go get a master's in it. So like I think that's great
Yeah.
because a lot of people who are kind of in our age range are like LCSWs by training or whatever, and they have an
Yeah.
interest in sports.
Yeah.
They were athletes themselves. Like I ended up in the role because I was an athlete and a coach. So like and then I had therapy as
Mhm.
this totally separate thing, but it wasn't like I was trained how to do therapy for student athletes. So it was
Exactly.
like, so I do think again, psychology, I generally say is at least 20 years behind the research. It takes that long to go from like good idea to
Yeah.
implementation. And I think sports athletics it takes a little bit longer on top of it. But
Yeah.
super awesome. Do you wanna talk about the sports real quick? I mean, you got student athletes coming in. I know volleyball really well because that's my sport. I'm an alum. I went to University of Minnesota for my undergrad, but I did grad school at Marquette.
Oh, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Trying to talk about sports.
I know basketball's always going on, right? Basketball's the big
Yeah,
the
yeah,
big
and
thing.
that men's basketball, I just won the Big East
Yeah.
championship. We have a phenomenal leader in Shaka Smart,
Hmm.
and I just actually got an email about him today, with some individuals like, hey, I heard he's really big on mental health and he does not play about that.
Yeah.
So I think with him kind of like spearheading that piece and just kind of being a wonderful example within Marquette, within the Big East. I mean, a lot of other schools within our mental health meetings reference him a lot.
Yeah.
He really takes a look at the student as a whole. So I could appreciate just kind of watching him blossom and anything that I need, he's like, what do we need to do? Like, how can I help you? What exactly do you need from me?
Yeah.
And it's not a gimmick. It's not like I'm just saying this to he really practices it. So, and I think and I could be misspeaking, but with Shaka coming to Marquette and really highlighting mental health and a lot of other things like player development is his thing as well. There have been so many students just from all over the country that will reach out to me to say, hey, I see your program is doing really great things in mental health. How can I do an internship there? I can't even count on my hands how many students want to be a part of Marquette's journey.
Yeah.
I think during one of our games, I think it was Marquette against Michigan, maybe, could be wrong. One of our last games in the NCAA tournament, Shaka took a 30-second timeout, and we're not going over any plays. We're going to do breathing techniques, right? And this is kind of like televised, and you'd be surprised how many emails I got. And they have a mental performance coach that they work with, just that specific team.
Yeah.
And so people were like, hey, I need to get in on this. What are you doing? And I'm like, well, okay, that wasn't me. But, we work alongside Shaka and his phenomenal team. But the sports, just outside of him as the coach, there's other coaches that really reach out to me. Ryan Ties, I think I'm saying his name correctly, volleyball coach. He kind of comes to me with just questions, say, hey, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
I'm having conflicts with these two girls. Like, how do I approach this? So I hope I continue to create these relationships where coaches kind of come to me and say, let's talk about mental health.
Yeah.
So sporting life, I think, is great at Marquette.
I know women's volleyball's number 12 preseason poll came out recently. They were 12 in the preseason poll, which is really awesome.
Women's lacrosse is kicking butt. I believe our golf team won the Big East Championship as well.
There we go, golf.
Yes, men's golf.
I don't follow golf at all, but...
And listen, and I'm learning, and I'm not an expert by any means, but just seeing the culture and seeing how close teams are, close coaches are, every team is rooting for the other team. I love going to games and seeing the volleyball girls at lacrosse or, vice versa. So it's really a huge family there. And I hope to continue to be a part of that family for as long as I can make it, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And keep seeing mental health grow. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. I love the approach and kind of what you're bringing to the department, but also like that balance of like person of therapist. Like, this is how I take care of myself and how I'm present for my family. Like that's so awesome. And it's just always ongoing work, even when we know this stuff and we look for this stuff. It's still always a balancing act. Yeah.
I'll definitely continue to work. Yeah.
Well, Kari, thanks so much for coming on. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And to all the listeners out there, thanks for tuning in once again. This is trying to get more sports performance stuff, been heavy on religious trauma, and we'll get some couple stuff thrown in too. So thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.